All of you are at least familiar with this, having been here once before, if not more. This is Structure 1515, and I'm Andrea Stumpf. And the deal is I take you through about 15 minutes of presentation with some slides, and then we go into some conversation, 15 minutes or more, depending on how much you'd like to spend on it. We have the fourth one today. This is the Inhouse Partner Custodian Secretariat. So every word is important in this header, and let's plunge right in. Let's see. Except that the slides aren't moving. Let's try again. Okay, here we go. This is a slide that I start with every time, which is to say, if the tree falls in the forest, it doesn't mean it didn't fall. So even though we don't really talk about these international partnership programs, I am here to tell you that it's a thing. It's actually a great modality in the international arena, and that it's also worth studying and understanding and essentially improving upon, especially from a structural perspective. So just definitionally, to kind of locate where we are, international partnership programs, to define the modality, we start in international space. So you're in the international arena. That means at least one or more international partners. But the key is that we are taking in this modality the old and adding the new. So in the international partnership program structure, an existing organization or institution, what I call the supporting entity, provides support to a new partnership, which is usually reflected in a dedicated governing structure. So a supporting entity plus a governing body. And then we also find that, the reality is these programs usually need funding. So there's almost always a third piece. And trying to get my cursor to work here. Okay, there's a third piece, which is that the trust fund gets added for funding purposes, some funding vehicle, and very often it's an international trust fund. That's also a new sort of dedicated piece to this. So when we first looked at this a couple of months ago, we pointed out that the supporting entity supports in two directions and often much more, but it's providing trustee support to the trust fund and secretariat support to the governing body. So in December, we looked at the difference between those two, secretariat and trustee. And last month in January, we looked at the trustee more carefully, and today we are looking at the secretariat more carefully. So let me start with my bias. As much as people might love the trustee, and they do, because that's where the money is, I love the secretariat. And if you show me a successful partnership program, I will show you a functioning secretariat. So in my experience, this can make or break the partnership. And it doesn't matter if you call it a secretariat or if it's just secretariat functions, even under the trustee label. The functions are somewhat different from what a trustee does. We'll point that out as we go. And it really can be quite relevant for the way the structure and the partnership program functions. So let's start with the notion that the secretariat is a collective. This is a word I use a lot in the partnership environment. And what I show here in the diagram are a number of collectives. So collectives are really the elements where the partners converge. And you have, for example, a governing body, which collects decision-making, shared decisions. You can have a trust fund, which collects or commingles the funds, so that's shared pooled funding. And then the secretariat also is creating a collective through this centralized support function for the partnership. So you can think of it as a set of functions, but I would also encourage you to think of it as a thing. It's a component, it's a structural component. It's a shared element. In that sense, it's a partnership element, and it's part of the structure and how it becomes a collective within the partnership program. So just to review, trustee, we said last time that's really all about the money, baby, but the Secretariat is mostly about the partners and the program. And I identify in my primer 5 main or common roles for Secretariats to play. Just to review them quickly, there's a consolidation role. It's really the glue that will hold things together. As we noted earlier, it's providing governance support for the governing body in terms of meetings and keeping meeting minutes. It's also a legal entity support. This rarely gets talked about. It's often taken for granted, but of course, if you're going to have Secretariat staff, somebody needs to hire them, or there's all sorts of things you have to procure to make your functions. I mean, for example, if you have a website, you have to get the server. So there's plenty of ways in which the legal entity aspect of the Secretariat is relevant. Secretariats can also play a very important risk function. They can be kind of gatekeeping or compliance engines within the context of the partnership program. And many Secretariats also have an implementation role where they directly undertake activities for the partnership. And then there's one other which I like to mention, and I have a whole chapter in my book on this, which is the custodial effect. So that's a term that I bring to the table, but it's trying to capture the role that Secretariats play for things that, you know, people may not have thought about or that were unanticipated, but somebody has to take care of it. And usually that ends up being the Secretariat. So it'll fall into the lap as the Secretariat acting essentially as a custodian for the partnership. So let's think about this. We have Secretariats in an existing organization, and we can think of it as an embedded, or another word is in-house Secretariat. I view this really as the special sauce of partnership programs. And if you need the image to go with it, here's your Big Mac with that special sauce. I encouraged you to think of it as a set of functions and as a thing, but I also now want you to think of the Secretariat as staff. So this is staff in the supporting entity. It's under supporting entity management, and it is operating under supporting entity rules. So this is in this hybrid nature, the Secretariat is within as a part of the supporting entity. And so to take it a little bit further, it actually means that what the Secretariat is doing is supporting entity work program. So, you know, when it's staff with management with rules, you're essentially doing the work program of the supporting entity. It comes as a package, but the location is really relevant. And some of you who have experienced Secretariats may be aware of the occasional Secretariat that would like to say that it is independent. But in fact, it's usually not, at least in this context, not independent in the usual sense of the word. It is a part of the whole. It's part of the supporting entity. It is integrated. It is fully supported, fully regulated within the supporting entity environment. So since we're talking about partnership programs, at this point, you may be asking yourself, how did I get, what? No, wait, wrong question. Wait a second, talking heads. Where is the partnership? All right, so this is a pretty supporting entity-centric view, so it's a valid question. And here it is. In essence, with these Secretariat staffs or Secretariats in international partnership programs, you have both things going on. So at the same time that the staff is part of the protected international organization, so that may be a World Bank or UN, it is also part of the partnership program. So you have two things happening simultaneously. And even more interesting is if you're looking for partnership, there's another place where the partnership comes in, and I have to get this cursor to work again. Let's see. Okay. It is worth noting that the supporting entity is in fact a partner itself. So again, this usually goes unarticulated, but it really changes the dynamic. It's not a contract for hire, usually. It's not just some kind of service provider, but it's usually an entity that steps up in partnership as a partner with the other partners where everyone is sharing the same development objective or the same missions and goals. So there's lots of partnership in this context, even though it's very supporting entity centric. And if you were looking carefully, you might have noticed that little P&I right there. So let's talk about that for a moment because it is quite relevant to the topic. P&I stands for privileges and immunities. And that is something that certain organizations, international organizations have, not all. It is actually something very special. And typically organizations like UN agencies or multilateral development banks, the Bretton Woods organizations have it. And it goes to staff, it goes to the organization itself, to the archives. But if you're lucky enough to have it, and it's one of the reasons these partnership programs gravitate towards these organizations, it's really important to understand that the P&I, the privileges and immunities, attach to the supporting entity, not the partnership program, but to the supporting entity. And so it is relevant whether you're holding yourself out to others as being one or the other. And for example, we've probably seen cases where Secretariat staff walk around with their business cards, if anybody uses them anymore, and it does not say the name of the supporting entity anywhere. And the email doesn't have the name of the supporting entity in it. And there's no indication of that supporting entity. In those cases, the P&I is actually a little precarious. It's an attenuated relationship. And we already know from the JAM case in 2019 that P&I can be vulnerable. So it is important that this idea that the Secretariat staff are part of the entity, supporting entity, and doing supporting entity work program, it's a key link in being able to get the privileges and immunities that the organization otherwise would provide. Okay, let's pause. I'm still on the clock here, so I don't want to pause too long, but I want to raise two words and zero in on two keywords. And I want to do it in the context of this very special photo, which is taken from outside my house in the creek right near us. And it is the photo, which I hope you'll see lots of. It is the new photo of the cover of my book coming out very shortly, the book for builders. And I'm trying to show certain notions here. So two words, one I will give you, and that is duality. So this idea that you've got two things going on at the same time is all over these partnership programs, definitely in the context of the inward-outward dynamic. So we have this duality, and now I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about what might be that second word that is reflected. And if you get it right, let me know, because then I'll feel like I did the cover photo properly. What's that second word? Big reveal. Balance. So balance and duality are really key themes that I put in my book, but I also really want in this conversation. And that's because secretariats really live the duality. They are inward embedded, as we've been discussing, and they're also outward focused, as we've been saying. And in this dynamic, they have what we sometimes call a dual loyalty. It's interesting because this comes up constantly day to day in what secretariats do, and yet people don't necessarily have the vocabulary to talk about it, or maybe even the conceptual framework to think about it. So I'm just going to give a couple of ideas as to how we can refer to this. One way is to say that the Secretariat has a reporting relationship to management and to the governing body, but it's a different reporting relationship. It's reporting managerially to the managers, and it is reporting informationally to the governing body. So there's qualitative difference. But of course, the Secretariat is doing more than just reporting informationally to the partnership. So another couple of words that I use is responsibility and accountability, to say that the Secretariat is responsible internally to managers and to the supporting entity overall, but is accountable externally to the governing body and to the overall partnership. And there are nuances there we can talk about later, but there is a distinction, and it is in this dual direction. And I have this little asterisk there just to mention that because these things are never straightforward, that Secretariat staff and these supporting entities very often have language in their governing documents of their organization saying that they have sole loyalty to their organization. So, you know, it is a little tricky, but in practice, it seems to work out. Again, something we can talk about more later. And one last slide, just to emphasize that this is a really organic environment. So you've got this duality, you're looking for balance. It's a really important skill set that Secretariat staff have, but it's something that is just perennial. It kind of keeps on going as the partnership program evolves, where you have these inward pulls and these outward pulls, and hopefully the partnership program will find its internal balance and keep its balance as it goes. So that is my presentation. Just gonna say very quickly, there's much more in the primer and more in the coming book for builders, hopefully out this month. I'm shooting for it. And just to say also, our next Structure 1515 is a month from today. What we've been building up to is to talk about conflicts of interest versus synergies. Now that we've discussed a lot of roles and responsibilities, trustee, secretariat, I think we can have a really good conversation about how those two play into partnership programs. And it's time for the conversation. So thank you very much. I'm kind of held myself to the time, and we have time to talk and we can easily go beyond, but would love to at least take the next 10 minutes and more to see if you have any thoughts or any questions for all of this. Please chime in, unmute yourselves, and hopefully we'll have a few things to say. Oh, and I should mention, because Jane Kirby-Zaki is on here, she is the author. Well, she was the leader of the working group at the World Bank, probably, Jane, you can say 10 years ago, where we looked at secretariats in the World Bank. And there's a wonderful working paper that never really saw the light of day that was produced. And some of these concepts come from that and were substantiated during those discussions. So thanks to Jane for all that work. And I think it's still as relevant now as it was then. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Andrea, can I just say thanks for the shout out? I don't know if you can see me here on my, I'm on my phone, but thank you for the shout out. And I do think that the concepts, you've presented a very orderly view of this, which has not been the case. I do think some of these issues have been a little bit clarified by the bank over time. So the applicability of bank policies and procedures, for example, which was not clear when we started. And I think the bank itself was guilty of kind of sending a double message about this type of thing. You know, oh, we're just a partner, you know, you don't, you know, we'll just do whatever you want. And then, you know, really at the end of the day, the bank had to kind of follow its own policies and procedures and, you know, live up to certain standards in terms of accountability. And I would also just mention IEG's role here. I think IEG has been both helpful in fleshing out this world of partnerships, but also drove the bank a little bit into certain rabbit holes, I would say, around conflicts of interest and things like that. And they presented a paradigm of the OECD corporate governance roles to evaluate these very unique partnership programs. When one of Margaret's last ideas that she shared with me, Margaret Tolwitz, whom you were mentioning earlier, she was doing some work for the German Development Institute on trust funds and other partnerships, is you have to see these things more as kind of a principal agent vehicle, you know, where money comes from donors, it comes into the bank, there's a contract, the bank is then responsible, but the bank is also operating, as you point out, in this environment of partnership. So I would say that that's a better model than IEG's definition of these things, where they were supposed to create a separate organization. That drove everybody down into, well, what is that organization? What's the corporate governance? Who's conflicted here? And that was the topic of a lot of those evaluations. And inevitably, IEG could only always find the bank conflicted rather than any other partner. So it was really, I think that the paradigm that you're presenting today is much more helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I would just add, I think your comments lead us directly to what we'll do next time, which is on the conflicts and synergies. These things are very related to each other. And I totally take your point on this corporate organizational paradigm being a confusion of what's going on. And I make a big distinction in my book too between formal and informal. And when we're talking about international partnership programs, we are truly talking about informal partnerships, but they're of course attached to, latched onto formal multilateral international corporate structures. So we have it, and we have to work with that, but the partnership piece is informal. It's not an organization or an entity in its own right from a legal perspective. Okay, any other thoughts?
Let
Hi,
me come in here.
Great to have you. Thank you.
Great to see you, but also a number of friends here, Nicola, Bo, etc. Great talk, as expected, and I'm so happy that in such a short time there's so much I could connect with and learn from, and really looking at the theory in a way and relating it very much to the praxis. I've just come out of very difficult, challenging negotiations at the CFS. This is the Committee on World Food Security. And I need to go back there, Andrea, in about 10 minutes, maybe max, because I need to make a closing statement on, anyway. You know, it is.
Thank you.
No. This was so important, and I can see Nicola is also smiling because she would have seen this kind of quandary that we are in. You know, at the CFS, she would have seen this so often. You know, borne out in her fantastic GAFSB Secretariat work that she did. But here, the issue is that we are dealing with several levels of interactions that the Secretariat of the CFS needs to deal with. So it's not the organization that it's hosted by, FAO, which is the legal entity that hosts it. And certainly I could relate to everything that you said, which is true of the dance, the delicate dance that the CFS Secretariat has to do, and lots of conflicts of interest here, etc. At the same time, it's got such a strong and vocal membership. This is, 180 states, member states, who are trying to pull the CFS in different directions. But then on top of that, a couple of other, layers of complexity, if you like. We've got a whole constituency called the civil society mechanism and the private sector mechanism as well. So the conflicts of interest compound in a way. And just to cut a long story short, I mean, I don't, this is not a question, just a little comment, and I'm sure a lot of you will relate to it. I've just got off the meeting when the civil society walked out. They have walked out saying,
wow.
saying, they can't even, and this is a virtual meeting, so it was not a physical walkout, but literally, saying that they're not abstaining, they're actually saying that they don't agree at all in the direction, these voluntary guidelines that are on the table right now, the direction that they're moving in, and it has nothing to do with the subject of the voluntary guidelines. These are their usual political ideological positions on trade and all of that. Anyway, the point I'm making here is they use the word conflict of interest. They feel that the Secretariat is not playing that independent role that you were talking about. Anyway, it's a tough CFS. Yes, Nicola. So I need to go back there, but I just wanted to say it's resonated so much to what's going on right now as I'm speaking.
So Shantanu, I want to tell you, please give every civil society member a copy of my book. I think that will solve all your problems.
I will reach out to them.
I mean, it is a very tough environment, but the first step is the respect for the supporting entity. You have to have that, and then you build from there. But I understand it's also very political, and people have their perspectives.
Tough negotiations.
Yeah.
Tough negotiations.
I wish we could join you. All the best.
And be a fly on the wall there, but also perhaps use that in your conflict of interest and synergies.
Yes.
You know,
Please join us next month.
How do we build that consensus and bring people around? I think a lot has to do with the way you chair, you know, and I remember Nicola, how well she used her diplomatic skills, leadership, etc., to bring different entities, you know, to the same, let's say, direction.
It's so true. I like to always make the point that these are organic, but at the end of the day, partners are people.
Great.
I have a whole chapter called Partners and People. And so having the right people in the right place is a big part of it.
Just want to apologize that I need to leave, but it was excellent. And thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
We'll continue.
We hope to see you next month and
continue interacting with you.
Survive your negotiations.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye now. My regards to everyone.
Thank you. All right. Maybe that elicits some comments from others. Any more thoughts?
Perhaps. Oh, Nicola, please.
Giovanni, hey.
No, go ahead, Giovanni, and then you can go ahead. I may need to mask again.
Giovanni, of course, on the heels of having been at IFAD, so you have the inside scoop on all this, right?
Well, look, it's first of all, it's such a pleasure to see you after so long and see so many familiar faces on this chat today. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the presentation. I think it was touching on one of the little beasts of this partnership that I think is the most challenging in some ways. And I think you touched upon a couple of very critical issues, and I also think Shantanu was hinting to what I think is one of the key aspects of having this balance work in this partnership, which is the staff that chairs and leads these secretariats. And I think, you know, we cannot understate how important it is to place people there that really understand the role they're playing. Because the two things, I mean, one of the key aspects that I think is making the whole relationship and role challenging is this duty of loyalty. And this is why it's important that the person that sits in these secretariats understands when it is time to say no. And because of this loyalty and direct relationship with what you even psychologically believe is somebody giving you the job, you're more prone to conceding to the governing body members more than, you know, understanding where your responsibility lies as a staff of the entity hosting the Secretariat. Having said that, which I guess...
just add that it's also usually the source of the paycheck.
Right.
Right, so money talks here too.
Absolutely. But having said that, which I guess, I don't know if we will have an answer today on what are the TORs of the perfect staff that we would need to place in these as heads of these secretariats. I think, and it's a conversation that I've had with some colleagues in LECDF about how do you make sure that the Secretariat plays the role that it's meant to play. Because I believe more and more we're seeing these secretariats being asked by the governing bodies to do a lot more than the key functions that you would expect a secretariat to do. I mean, when I joined the bank in 2009, actually, when I was in legal, I joined in Legan working with Maurizio Ragazzi on advising the Jeff Secretariat, which of all secretariats we know has its special status in the constitutive documents, but also psychologically, it's something that they really closely feel. And I'm hinting now about the push of some secretariats to do implementing agency type of functions, right? So bodies tasking the coordination unit to hire specialists to do a research paper, for example, or starting to give out grants or awards to do some flagship program or the like, right? Which is even further, I believe, blurring the line of implementing partners versus secretariat, but also then moving the roles into areas that are really not proper for what a secretariat should do. So I was curious to know what your thoughts were on both issues, which I think are very, very, very sensitive. And also going forward, how we can structure more or clearer documentation from the legal side that perhaps can help in clarifying this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Giovanni. And I know you speak from experience too, from working with quite a few of these in different contexts. I would say a couple of things in response, and I'm curious to hear what others think as well. One is that, well, I'll give an example of where it gets difficult. I can think of a number of secretariats that have been affected by HR requirements, human resources requirements of the bank, which either say you're capped at a certain number of staff because that's what's applying to everyone else at the bank, or whatever the organization is, but at least here in the World Bank, or that apply the 357 rule. You have to transfer, you've done your 7 years, now you're going to go out in the field, and then take someone from the field and plop them into the secretariat without recognizing that it's a special skill set and that there's some training that goes into it, and that it's not totally fungible with bank operations. Or, too often staff are treated as commodities, but there's a certain expertise or a certain level of experience that is necessary for this very delicate role that secretariat staff are playing. So that is not recognized fully when HR comes in from a mainstream perspective and says all rules apply to you. So it's one of the pieces where we see the secretariat as having this special role, but it's not necessarily implementable or respected within a corporate institutional environment. So that would be one point. The other point, very briefly, is just to say, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that some of these roles are inappropriate for secretariats. I think in some cases, some contexts, certain things can and very efficiently could be implemented by a secretariat, so that extending into some of the implementation, I wouldn't say it's off limits, but you're right, it starts to blur. And then it's really helpful to recognize that these things are modular, that you have secretariat type functions that are support functions that we talked about, in the slides, but there may be other add-on functions coming out of that supporting entity. And how does that all fit together? So it has to be structured, it has to be recognized and articulated. Everyone has to understand which base we're on. But I think there's room for really leveraging the supporting entity in many different respects, whether it's through a secretariat function or other functions, partly to be defined. It's one of the things I like about these programs is that there's a lot of room for definition. What I think would be very helpful is if the bank someday, World Bank, would ever potentially decide to recognize secretariats, perhaps even as a business line, and give it some articulation and give it some, doesn't have to be policies, but some dimensions, some legitimacy. That could go a long way to starting to, do some of the shaping that, Giovanni, I think you would probably see as necessary.
Can I come in on this? Because I agree with you, Andrea, on this point. Sorry, I may need to mask up again quickly because got workmen in another end of my home. It would be really helpful to see in your analysis, actually, the supporting entity isn't monolithic, right? And just thinking about it in the World Bank case, and here we go, sorry. in the World Bank case, you've got manager of the unit who is or may be managing the Secretariat staff. And you have other parts of the bank, including, but not limited to, those who handle partnerships, in the bank acronyms DFI, which have different objectives. And then there's management overall, which has different objectives, including but not limited to fundraising for the organization itself, etc. So separating out the it would be interesting to see, because I like the way you break down your analysis, but a little bit more separating out the analysis of the supporting entity, because that can lead to those conflicts of interest that you're pointing to. And I want to thank you for bringing up the potential issues with, say, HR, because from the perspective of somebody who's managed a secretariat, and for those who don't know, I have not just that, but I've also advised on a number of conflict of interest issues that various partnerships and secretariats have faced. Jane, yes, we've been through stuff. Yes, so I do think it's important. Your point about developing a business line for secretariats, being more purposeful about that, I think is really important. And I do want to give an example, though, of that builds on your HR experience, and that is that the Secretariat has a budget. It has been given by the donors. There is a plan. There's a staffing plan, and the Secretariat moves to fill that staffing plan. And it's been approved, including by the partners around the table, and that includes the supporting entity. And yet, the Secretariat does not have full autonomy over the HR process. In fact, has very limited authority. And the example that I'm thinking of, it took over a year to fill a position because the head of the Secretariat didn't have the authority to do the HR processes, was working through management, 2 different managers, things fell through the cracks. And there is that accountability to the governing body, which was wondering, well, where's the staff? And one needs to be very diplomatic when one is responding to this, but after a year, diplomatic skills may take a back seat. So I wanted to really emphasize that that Secretariat staff are often in this really challenging position. Finally, on Giovanni's point about, yeah, I agree with you, Andrea, that there are some, sorry, there's the work going on, that some tasks may seem shocking for some secretariats to undertake, but for instance, the idea of a research paper that if it's in the founding documents, if that's something that the Secretariat might be expected to undertake on behalf of the partnership with the proper budget and with the proper oversight, not a shocking thing at all. It could be the case that it goes way over the line into implementation issues, or it could be that it's very much within the description of the Secretariat and the founding documents. And I'm going to mute myself so you don't hear that fabulous noise.
Andrea, can I come in here on this?
Oh, absolutely, please.
I do think that with the trust fund reform, finally, the most recent, they've recognized that trust funds, in fact, are trust funded programs, not just like these accounts sitting there. So, that's in fact the driving focus of the regular IBRD trust funds now, is to be part of these, what they're calling umbrella 2.0 programs, but it's basically the same old trust funded programs that we know. And I think this is good because that clarifies a lot of these issues. And in fact, program management and administration is much more clarified as a function. It's paid for through a certain type of grant with those restrictions, and commissioning reports, all those sorts of things are now recognized as that function. I think the fifths, however, probably are causing a lot of these issues. And there was a fifth framework paper that was issued. It was issued by DFI, so I don't know how much there is in it on secretariats. It's probably mainly focusing on the trustee role, which is fabulously done by the bank and by our former DFI colleagues. They're like excellent at this, but it is in fact the simplest part of these programs. So I think the devil is more around these issues of what is the secretariat's role when the secretariat is the bank in one of these fifth programs. It's not all arm's length, oh, I know nothing about what's going on. And the Chinese wall approach sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. So I think for the bank's side of this, I'm going to certainly follow up after this and get the new fifth framework and see if it says anything about this, because that would be the only place I could imagine where anyone's doing any work. And I would suspect that there's very little about it because it was done by the trustee from the trustee point of view. So, and I think that, you know, as your colleague, was it Giovanni, was pointing out, the GEF is such a special program and it's a model for others. So I think but not every fifth program based in the bank is the GEF from a constitutional perspective either. So, you know, there's apparently when they went to the board with the trust fund policy recently, the #1 focus for questions was on transfers out under regular trust funds, because there's also it's a kind of a partnership element there. And that part is one thing that people still want to understand more. So just to make a long story short, I think that I'm certainly going to look at the fifth framework after this and see if it says anything that would help bank staff about this. And if not, then I think that's a clear agenda for DFI to try to work with legal and people like you to bring more clarity, because I'm hearing the pain.
Yeah, and maybe just to step back for a moment, a lot of the conversation is about the World Bank, because most of us on this call are World Bank. Thank you, Kareem, for indulging us. But this is an issue that isn't World Bank specific. There are many organizations that play either hosting or housing roles. There's a wide range of approaches to this. But I think the principle that Shantanu was speaking to is common, which is that you have this duality and you have this tension, no matter where you put the balance. And Jane, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about whether the word hosting is appropriate or housing is appropriate. There's a lot of baggage to those terms, but in essence, what we're saying is the relationship more arm's length, not fully, but a little more separated, or less arm's length, more integrated. And those are all things that need to be defined. And I think it would be interesting for not just the World Bank, but other organizations to have the ability to think about different modalities and different circumstances. It's all very contextual. And I think also even the distinction between FIFs and IBRD IDA trust funds doesn't always work. We have some very large IBRD IDA trust funds that have some very FIF-like qualities, or at least very strong secretariats that go above and beyond what the trust funds are. And where is the room for that piece? You know, that kind of doesn't fit neatly into the umbrella paradigm and doesn't need to fit into the FIF. It can still be more integrated rather than less integrated, or more all-encompassing rather than more limited. So there are all these variations, and part of what I try to do is help people see where they are in the landscape and have the vocabulary to even be able to talk about it. And if you can parse what the functions are, and you can see where the elements fit and who's relating to whom, then I think you can have a conversation that tries to work with the duality and find the balance.
I agree with you on that. And I want to come back to Shantanu's experience with the CFS right now. And he mentioned the private sector mechanism and the civil society mechanism, which I'm not sure how familiar everybody on the call is with them, but they are very important stakeholders of the CFS, which is housed at FAO. And the conflicts of interest that Shantanu is mentioning, that the civil society mechanism will have been bringing up, I don't need to have been in that meeting to know that much of it arises from concerns that the civil society mechanism has about the private sector mechanism. So it's the conflict, not the conflicts of interest, but the conflict is between these two important stakeholder groups that they are the lifeblood of the CFS. And there's this small secretariat housed in teeny tiny offices in the FAO building in Rome. But that secretariat has to try to manage those different, this very conflictual relationship. So providing them with the vocabulary, I mean, they tend to reduce it to conflicts of interest. The conflicts of interest becomes used as a weapon in this case. I'm saying this without him being there, but I'm pretty sure he would agree with me on this. So the service that you provide, giving that vocabulary to help unpack it and see if there is a way forward. They manage a group of experts and they come out with guidelines, and all of these are fraught. The negotiations, they're UN type of negotiations. So you got the member states making their official statements and the different stakeholders making their official statements. So let me stop there, but just to say that I think you could provide a real service to helping them think through these issues. Thanks.
Andrea, may I come in as well?
Please, Duncan.
Good to see you, and good to see a number of familiar faces on the screen. Thank you as always for what is always a very informative, very pithy presentation. Particularly enjoy listening to you on these. Giovanni did take the words out of my mouth about what I think is at the core of the issues that we address on a daily basis. And it sounds like it's, at least everybody who's spoken so far has pinpointed, the challenges of balancing the expectations of our partners on the one hand, and the need to operate within a policy framework that governs the manner in which the supporting institution runs its affairs. And it'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to listening to your conflicts of interest presentation in the next session. Particularly, and I'm hopeful you will unpack that, what you described as the accountability to the governing body versus the responsibility, I think, to the supporting entity, because that is where the friction. So the rubber meets the road, and I think that's the point of friction. So looking forward very much to that. Just to Jane's point on the fifth framework paper, yes, please do read it, because it actually does go into some detail about defining with more clarity what the hosting arrangements should be for fifths going forward. There are a couple of ideas in there, some still being fleshed out, about trying to define with more clarity what the rights and duties and obligations of the Secretariat on the one hand and the supporting entity on the other should be. And one of the innovative proposals that's been made in that paper and that is now being implemented is actually for entering into formal hosting arrangements with the fifths, with the governing body, about how the Secretariat hosting arrangements will work, in a bid to try and again resolve those tensions. You now have, I think Giovanni mentioned the Jeff. We do have other fifths now that are actually bigger than the department that's hosting them, right? That have more staff, have a bigger budget in some respects than the bank department that's hosting them. How do you deal with a fifth of that nature? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out across the board. But I mean, those are things that have engaged us in DFI and that they're trying to address. So thanks again, Andrea. Pleasure listening to you. I will have to drop off in a few minutes, but certainly look forward to attending more of these.
It's great to have you, Duncan. And you guys are really where the rubber hits the road. There's probably a lot of screeching going on. But continuing to try to innovate into ways that will be effective for both the bank and the partners that join in. So it's really interesting to hear you. Yeah, I think we're well over the half hour and we're close to the hour. So maybe we look for any last comments or last questions so that we can then close out and look forward to, I do need to sit back and do the slides and be really thoughtful about the conflicts presentation. There's a lot to say there, but hopefully we'll have most of you back on for that. That should be a great discussion as well.
Thank you, Andrea. This is Karim, perhaps just to reflect on what I heard, and thank you again for this thought-provoking talk and also the feedback of the colleagues. My experience is really mainly with embedded secretariats, and as the colleagues pointed out, obviously you're trying to kind of balance potentially conflicted interests is easier said than done. But I suspect really the hosting institution, which is providing the secretarial support, that secretariat basically the starting point is that it is not neutral, because your loyalty is to your organization, and even if the donors are funding that secretariat, but ultimately you are being employed by the host institution. So you're trying to move from that perceived kind of bias to a position of neutrality, and that takes time to get to the point where you really are becoming perceived by the partners are being really a neutral and even-handed party in the conversation, and trying to be an effective consensus builder. So, and that takes a lot of time, a lot of skill, and it's easier said than done. But I'd be inclined to think that we would be kidding ourselves if we are hosting a faithful multi-donor trust fund, that the donors would view the secretariat provided by the hosting institution as being sort of neutral from day one. That wouldn't be the starting point, in my humble opinion. And again, thank you for inviting me in, and for all the good stuff I've heard from all of you this evening. Thank you.
That's great, Karim. Thank you so much. I'm sure the Islamic Development Bank experience has a lot of interesting things for us to reflect on, especially as you also are innovating and looking at different ways to support these partnerships. I am such a believer in these international partnership programs and this combination of the existing organization with the new partnership piece, that I think, as difficult as it is and as much time as it takes, it is really worth continuing to find the avenues and to develop the skill sets, to really think about this as an area where you want staff to be competent, where you want your organization to put its best foot forward and really be able to exercise its comparative advantage. So I'm hopeful that these conversations and some more focus on structuring and staff and these component aspects can really create an environment where it ends up being effective more than difficult, efficient more than conflicting. And so maybe we convene then next month and pick it up on the conflicts front and see if we come to some further understandings that can support these international partnership programs and their secretariats and their trustees. So thank you to all, and have a great month till we meet again next time. Thank you.